Hello. Hello. My name is Caitlin Henline, and I am discussing tradition and modernity in contemporary Korea through the impact of the sexualization of K-pop idols. So, to make my argument, I think it is important to define a couple of terms, such as tradition, modernity, invented tradition, which will be brought up later, and sexualization within context of how I'm talking about them. In my context, tradition is defined by etymology as customs, beliefs, doctrines, etc., that are handed down from one generation to the next. Etymology also defines modernity as not antiquated or obsolete and in harmony with present ways. Invented tradition is defined by Hobsbawm in The Invention of Tradition as an attempt to establish continuity with a suitable historical past. And I define sexualization meaning a sexual objectification or reducing one to their sex value. Now, to define K-pop, I must first define what music, as defined by Keith Howard in Invented Traditions in North and South Korea. He says that music is sound, so written records as well as oral history are always inadequate, since they are selective and insufficient to prove constancy over time. And this also brings in how what Elaine W. Chun argues in How to Drop a Name, Hybridity, Purity, and the K-pop Fan. She discusses how K-pop is characterized by a complex semiotics, one that seemingly transcends traditional constructs of race, nation, and language, perhaps even dismantling them in the process. And Yoon Young Jung argues in Playing the Race and Sexuality Cards in the Transnational Pop Game, Korean Music Videos for the U.S. Market, how popular music should traverse national boundaries somewhat more easily. Which, for the context of K-pop, brings in what Joshua Neves and Bhaskar Sakar in Asian Video Cultures in the Penumbra of the Global say is the assertion of the supposed transparency of global consumer culture, declared superficial and homogenizing, despite its ability to elicit spontaneous, affective, and often bodily responses, and a fascination with the enigmatic and exotic appeal of K-pop, which triggers uncontrollable internet consumption. And this brings attention to what Annalee Swan in Situated Knowledge, Transnational Identities, Place and Embodiment in K-pop Fan Reaction Videos discusses as K-pop is intentionally stylized as a messy mixture of the foreign, local, and everywhere in between. And all of this is just to say that K-pop is a very complex within its own self, as the groups take from multiple different types of music as well as types of dance. And K-pop itself is actually what Zixuan Zhao, in exploring the relationships between K-pop fans' identities and media consumption in Web 2.0 era, says how YouTube plays an essential role in K-pop distribution. And YouTube is a very modern invention, and for K-pop to be dispersed so easily through this, rather than its traditional orally and through performances that must be attended in person. And now it has this more global scale, which brings to the forefront the way that male and female K-pop idols are dispersed in how they are viewed and portrayed. Firstly, with male K-pop idols, Linda Kuo, Simone Perez Garcia, Lindsey Burke, Vic Yamasuk and Thomas Lee discuss how in the discourse of domination, Asian American women are stereotyped as subservient and hypersexualized, whereas men are portrayed as asexual or effeminate, and go on to discuss how whiteness and masculinity equal power within the Asian American, or within the American dynamic, whereas gay and Asian American men are seen as feminine and passive. This translates to K-pop boy bands being popular because within their context, they can allow for heteronormative fantasies simultaneously with a queer persona, behavior, and content being thrown forward. And K-pop itself becomes this icon for Asian queerness, whereas it's very separate from Western gender and sexual norms. And within Korea, it can make queer youth feel more like a community. And this is also discussed by Choyun Oh and David C. Oh in Unmasking Queerness, Blurring and Solidifying Queer Lines Through K-Pop Cross-Dressing, how K-pop male singers are often called flower boys because of their slender, androgynous bodies and fashion-conscious, beautiful appearance. Though this is not necessarily negative for the youth, as Layung Shin says in Queer Eye for K-pop Fandom, Popular Culture, Cross-Gender Performance, and Queer Desire in South Korean Cosplay of K-pop Stars, how this identification with male stars shows how such stars are not always the object of heterosexual desire, but can also be the object of cross-gender identification for female fans. And this discusses how female fans in the Korean context will dress the way exactly as male K-pop stars do, and they will essentially become like these, and how it actually allows for the young queer female fans to display their appearance and explore without fear of rejection. What's most interesting is it's not only the female fans that also take on this persona and copy these male K-pop stars, because in transnational audiences and Asian American performance in the musical K-pop, Miyoko Conley discusses the Asian American experience with K-pop, where she brings up how easily an Asian American YouTuber named Ryan Higa made a parody K-pop group called Boys Generally Asian, BGA for short, that not only brought attention to the fetishization of K-pop idols, but also to the impossibility of clearly defining the geographical boundaries of K-pop groups, which brings forth how, interestingly enough, male K-pop stars just have this blurred boundary of where they belong. And this also, of course, becomes a female K-pop idol thing too, as they are most effectively shown in two separate lights. And one of them is as Choyun Oh in K-Popscape, Gender Fluidity and Racial Hybridity in Transnational Korean Pop Dance discusses a K-pop girl group called SNSD are, quote, good girls as they serve heterosexual, submissive Confucian womanhood. And in contrast to that, a performer named CL's performance of a bad girl presents a strong, wild, independent, homoerotic, and black or third world femininity, which cannot be authentically Korean, and therefore separates the female K-pop idols, so that those that are not efficiently Korean are effectively othered and therefore not a threat to authentic Korean. And Z. Lynn Robert Rudolph discusses in Does K-pop Reinforce Gender Inequalities? Empirical Evidence from a New Data Set, how much of the lyrical content in girl groups' music reveals how K-pop organizes or manipulates young female idols' femininity in order to meet socially prescribed role expectations in a male-dominated society, either the Western stereotypes of Asian American women as exotic sexual objects or the Korean patriarchic role as submissive, fragile, and innocent maidens. And this is actually discussed by Hui-won Kim and Tae-in Han in Body Image Concerns Among South Korean Kindergartners and Relationship to Parental, Peer, and Media Influencers, how extensive exposure to appearance-focused media such as K-pop TV programs could be a concern due to their emphasis on physical appearance, potential to influence children's beauty standards. And they discussed how girls 5 to 6 year olds desired to be thinner the more that they watched these programs. And this was a study of 90 girls in South Korea of this age, and how watching this made them want to be different. In contrast, in Why South Korea's Young Men Are Turning Conservative, Stella Finley and Dr. Jae Song actually discuss how many men discount the sacrifices that are standard for a lot of women. With military service still compulsory in South Korea for men under 30, it's increasingly seen as a disadvantage for men, while women are perceived as free to pursue their lives. And to tack on to that, in Pride and Protest, it's discussed how gay rights activists in South Korea often have to contend with insults and threats of violence because there are no anti-discrimination laws. And adding all of this onto each other, there was a study by Hyemin Lee, Joo-young Park, Bak Young Choi, Horim Yi, and Suing Sups Kim in association between discrimination and depressive symptoms among 2,162 lesbian, gay, and bisexual adults in South Korea. Does community connectedness modify the association? They found that 49.4% of men and 80.9% of women experience at least one kind of discrimination, physical appearance being most common, and the depressive symptoms were 5 to 7 times higher among LGBT adults than general population. And they found that community connectedness actually became a protective factor to lower that risk. Which all of this to bring forth and say that K-pop idols do have a negative impact when they are not brought forth as part of the discussion of how, when they are simply ignored, then they have a negative impact. And if it's just appearance-based, it cannot do more than harm for the young children. But as the age increases among the Koreans, it is found that they have a very traditional mindset that K-pop idols, while fulfilling this more modern convention of music and social media and whatnot, are actually bringing forth attention to the issues that face the LGBT community, who are bonding as they all fight the same struggle. And so K-pop is actually a very traditional music form that, while it's cloaked in modernity, it's actually putting forth a lot of invented traditions that are this conglomerate of Korean Confucian ideals and westernized notions of sex appeal. And what this says about contemporary Korea is that it is very traditional still and very hardworking at concealing that with this thin layer of modernity through the K-pop idols. But when looking further, you see that there is an intense wage gap. There is an intense appearance that is put forward and not understood as false, which means that many Koreans are suffering, especially LGBT plus community members, as they have no protections in place. And many people do not understand that globally, that Korea is not as modern as they would suspect at first, and they do not look further. And US audiences especially ignore all of the ways that Korean history does not equal American history, and therefore clump the Koreans with Asian Americans who can only half understand the history differences. And that concludes my discussion of tradition and modernity in contemporary Korea through the impact of the sexualization of K-pop idols.